Intel's 11600K i5 CPU is probably one of the most interesting out of the three major CPU launches today. And that's because it's about $270, at least on Newegg at the time we checked. And that makes it extremely price competitive with AMD's R5 5600X, even if the 5600X were always available at MSRP, which is it's still sort of repopulating the stock. So we're reviewing the 11600K in this video. We have an 11900K review going up later today as well. And this is how we got it from Intel, but the CPUs are solid state, so they should be fine. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's new keyboards. EVGA's new Z20 and Z15 RGB optical mechanical gaming keyboards have abundant RGB LEDs and programmable macro keys on the left side of the keyboard. They also have a sensor to detect and turn on the LEDs when you're in front of the keyboard and turn them off when distant, offering a unique feature for keyboards. The keyboard claims a 0.5 millisecond response time and 100 million keystroke lifespan. Learn more at the link in the description below. As we ramped into this review of the 11600K, we had a brief call with Intel and PR just to talk about some of the overclocking and expectations and things like that. One of the things that I told Intel PR ramping into the review was that I want to see a good fight between AMD and Intel. It's good for everyone, it's healthy for the industry, it keeps everyone interested and engaged, and it keeps the job interesting. So I told them, you know, I don't want to see a fight between Logan Paul and Floyd Mayweather. I want to see a good fight. So we're hoping today that Intel can deliver just that, which is a good matchup against AMD. Rocket Lake looks to be sort of a stopgap solution, and it was certainly supposed to come out a lot longer ago than it actually did come out. And Alder Lake isn't that far ahead at this point, which makes buying Rocket Lake, even if it's in a competitive positioning, feel a little bit, well, not great. Sort of like buying KB Lake when you got the 8700K later that year. That certainly didn't feel great. Something just fell over. That certainly didn't feel great to the 7700K buyers at the time. Now, basics, we already have a video from the news announcements of all the specs, pricing, things like that. We're not going to go back over it here. If you want to learn that stuff, it'll be linked in the description below, but it's just brochure knowledge at this point. What we're interested in is benchmarks today. So a couple of important points. First of all, we've already covered Z590 versus Z490 and all the chipset differences that are relevant in that previous video linked below if you're curious. $270 is about the listing price for the 11600K when we checked. The 11700K we already reviewed, but we have a revised benchmark with it in many of the applications today because of a microcode update that came out in the final hours of the launch cycle here. So there has been a slight update to the 11700K. Now, unfortunately, just to kind of TLDR this for you, the 11700K with the microcode update and as compared to the 11600K, looks even more pointless than before. So our opinion remains basically the same, that it's a waste of sand. The sand would be better on a beach or in, as we say later, an 11600K. And that's because the 11600K competes so directly with the 11.7 in gaming workloads that even with a microcode update, it's just hard to care about the 11.7. But that review is already up. It's been a few changes to the numbers because of the U-code update, and we'll go over that today. Now, for comparisons, the 5600X is the most apt comparison from AMD. It is currently $350 on Amazon US when we checked. That CPU has been as low as $300-ish, but that's pending how available it is, obviously. So if it comes down to $300 when this video launches, great. That changes a few things, but the price gap is still $30 favoring Intel here. So Intel is now positioned as more of the value brand rather than what it used to be, which was AMD being the value brand. Enough of all that, let's get right into it. We have frequency validation, overclocking, games, production benchmarks, power benchmarks, and more. And we'll be doing overclocking live streams probably later this week alongside the 11900K review later today. So check back for all that. Let's get into the benchmarking. We'll start with validating the frequency behavior in both Blender and Cinebench. Beginning with Blender, the 11700K from last time plots as the first line and shows the expected behavior. There's a drop after about 56 seconds following tau expiry on the ASUS board, and then the CPU drops to around 4000 to 4100 megahertz. The 11600K, meanwhile, plots at about 4400 megahertz, all cores sustained after tau expiry, except its default behavior was to expire tau after around 86 seconds instead of 56. We checked with Intel, and the official guidance is still 56 seconds for this part. As we've said in the past, that's not technically the specification from Intel, but it's how the CPUs are marketed and how they're expected to perform when factoring in all of those marketed metrics, including TDP. As such, we adjust this appropriately for any performance testing to follow the official guidance provided to the motherboard manufacturers. Otherwise, everything looks correct aside from this tau number in the out-of-box configuration for the 11600K. Quickly checking Cinebench, we found the maximum sustained single-core frequency at a given interval was about 4900 MHz on the 11600K when tested out-of-box. That aligns with the advertised 4.9 GHz peak boost, which is listed in the Intel official spec sheet, and allows for a range of 4600 MHz all-core to 4900 MHz single-core. The 11700K is plotted on this chart as well under the ASUS single clock listing in case you wanted to see a comparison to one step up. You'll see in a moment that the latest beta BIOS and microcode update helps the Intel i7-11700K that we reviewed previously, but not in a way that changes our opinion of it or of its relative hierarchical positioning, which is to say, those things aren't good. The CPU was, and still is, a waste of sand. You'd be better off with it on a beach or in an 11600K instead. We did, however, want to test the 11700K's frequency again to see how much uplift was from frequency changes with the microcode versus lower level changes. In this chart, you can see the F1 2020 results rank the 11700K 0605 update at about the same frequency, with very occasional spikes a few megahertz higher at the start of the workload. Frequency doesn't seem to be much influenced by the microcode update, nor was tau, which was already correct on the ASUS board anyway, leaving improvements lower down in the code, but still present. F1 2020 shows the microcode advantage in the 11700K, moving up to 304 FPS average from a previous of 287. That's not as high as when the turbo limits are ignored, but it's higher than the previous microcode. It's not our focus for today. It's just worth pointing out since the 11700K has moved around a little bit in the final hours of launch. The Intel i5-11600 that we're focusing on ran at 298 FPS average, demonstrating wholly what a waste the 11700K is at $400 if you're playing games. The 11600K is even closer to the 11700K than the 10600K was to the 10700K, previously an 11% gap, and we recommended the 10600K wholesale over the 10700K when those two came out. That remains true here, bumped up one generation. The 117K only has a 2.2% lead over the 11600K. Compared to AMD, the 5600X maintains a 7.9% lead over the 11600K, but the 11600K is listed at the time of writing for $270 on Newegg. That's a lot better than the $350 we're seeing right now for the 5600X. And it's an easy choice over the AMD CPU given this specific positioning. If we were at $300 for the 5600X, it'd be a much tougher selection between the two. Highlighting the overclocking result, it was worthwhile. We gained about 6% with an OC, and it is stable, and that put the 11600K on par with the 10900K and not distant from a stock 5600X, although then it becomes an arms race, obviously, because you could OC the 5600X also, and we've done that heavily in the past if you'd like to watch our old content. At 1440p, the 11600K ended up at 267 FPS average, spacing it apart from the 5600X by only 3 FPS. For averages. The CPUs all start to blend together here thanks to other limitations, namely the GPU. Intel technically leads with the higher end SKU, and we'll see how the 11900K does in our next review. But AMD's R5 and R7, alongside Intel's i5 and i7, are all about the same as each other from a functional standpoint. You're not really going to notice a difference at this point, especially in a game like this. If you're a Rainbow Six Siege junkie, the small FPS differences might really matter to you, or more likely, you might think they matter to you, in which case we'll get to that soon. Red Dead Redemption 2 is up now. This one has the 11700K mostly corrected from where it was before the beta microcode update, now at 175 FPS average and ahead of the 11600K OC by 1 FPS. Stock to stock, the 11700K leads the 116 by 2.8%. That's not quite error, but it's real close to it, and this reinforces our original opinion that the 11700K is wasted money for gaming. You would be far better off spending the difference on a better GPU, or something else that's not even in the computer. Compared to the 5600X, the 11600K outpaces it in this game, and by 4.5%, Intel is finally, slowly climbing ahead. It's about the same as the 5800X as well. In Total War 3 Kingdoms and the battle benchmark, the 11600K ran at 205 FPS average at 1080p. The 11600K ends up equivalent to the 11700K, even with the 0605 microcode update on ASUS. This game just doesn't recognize the difference in CPUs because we're becoming clearly bound. In the case of Intel, we're actually more bound by the cache clock than we are by the GPU. You can see that in our OC. With an all-core OC only, which we've tested in the past and have shown for this game, we would still be stuck at 205 FPS average. Adding the cache OC that you see here gave us room to boost to 208 FPS average. AMD could also push here with memory and F-clock tuning, but then you'd have to tune the memory on Intel, and again, we're back at arms race territory for what is approximately the same ceiling to performance at the end of the day. The uplift over the 10600K stock to stock was about 10% before hitting the cache ratio wall. The 11700K's only potential benefit here is higher 1% lows, but these aren't particularly meaningful at this level of difference. Hitman 3 is our newest game added to the bench. In this one, the 11600K performed at 131 FPS average, about 11% better than the 10600K, and just behind the 10700K and 5600X. The 11600K is good value here, especially at the $270 price we spotted, and establishes a stronghold for Intel back in the i5 range. The overclock pushed the 11600K up to 10900K levels, or about the same as the 11700K with that microcode update. Rainbow Six Siege is up now. The 11600K stock CPU posted a result of 444 FPS average. We need to rerun the 11700K with the microcode update for this one still, so it's missing from this chart, but the previous test plus some common sense put it as around a plus or minus single-digit percentage difference from the 11600K CPU anyway. The 5600X outdid the 11600K by about 2.2% here, marking the Intel 11600K as in an advantageous position from its price to performance, which far outweighs the 2% change in performance for the 5600X favorite. It's a role reversal. AMD has positioned itself as the perceived high-quality brand now, while Intel is coming in as a value option, although one that's maybe regarded as a bit more stable than some of the past value options we've had in the market. It's not a bad thing to switch like this, and it should be good for the market overall and create a healthier set of options between the two companies. The overclocked 11600K climbs to 457 FPS average, which is a gain of 3%. In this workload, not particularly exciting, but other CPUs show that there's plenty of room for scaling on the CPU side with the right set of hardware. At 1440p, we saw what we pointed out in our 11700K review. Intel, due to a combination of NVIDIA GPU and driver behavior, now sweeps the charts when GPU bound. AMD ends up falling behind with the 3080 when GPU bound in Rainbow Six specifically, allowing the 11600K a position just behind the 8-core 16-thread CPUs from Intel and leading the 5600X by about the same as the 5600X led it in the previous chart, roughly 2%. Cyberpunk testing is up now. This one doesn't have a patch from the March 29th update, but it has all the patches prior to that. The data ultimately is important for its relative scaling anyway, so that's fine. The 11600K stock CPU and 11700K stock CPU are identical and within run-to-run variance and error when testing. The 10700K is also aligned with these, and the 11600K OC shows that there's some room for uplift, but not a ton. In this particular game, we receive a sobering insight, and it's that, like 1440p and some of our other tests, a GPU bottleneck eventually will limit the advantage from certain CPUs. There's nothing more to gain here because we're bound elsewhere in the system, and so they all look the same. It's not useful from the standpoint of producing a CPU review because we're hitting a limit, so we don't actually know how much better one CPU is from the next because it's bound. But something will bottleneck in any computer, and most of the time for gaming, that's the GPU. Not always. Sometimes it's memory, like in Total War, or cache, like in Total War, or it could be the CPU, like in Rainbow Six. But the GPU is often a limit, and this is what that looks like. In other words, get the 116 or 5600X, doesn't really matter, and then spend the difference on the GPU. GTA 5 hobbled out of its corner for another round of fighting. This one is interesting because Intel CPUs show more scaling against their predecessors here than in some of the other newer games. And that's thanks to the nature of these older titles. The 11600K ran at 134 FPS average, ranking it ahead of the 10900K and the 9900K in this testing. The overclock pushed it an impressive 7% in this title, right behind AMD's flagship and ahead of Intel's own 11700K. The stock result is adjacent to the 5600X and functionally the same. In that sense, either one would be good here, but the cheaper one should win, and that's the 11600K for today's review. GTA 5, as we see here, is still useful for determining the behavior in certain types of games, and it's still one of the most popular games on Steam, but this isn't representative necessarily of how all games perform, especially the modern ones, and you can check our other benchmarks in this video for those. At 1440p, things don't change too much except for the very top end of results very marginally moving around, so we'll move on quickly to production benchmarking. Here's a quick look at our overclock stepping chart for the 11600K. Patrick Stone walked through this process for his first review OC endeavor, after which I went through and cleaned up some of the final numbers, optimizing the voltage and the frequency settings from what you see here. With an LLC level of 5, vCore was close to 1.39 volts get when set to 1.44 to 1.45 in BIOS. So we ended up with a vget of around 1.4 to 1.41 at the end of the whole process. That's around where the last several generations of Intel have been for a decent overclock. Not necessarily one we recommend copying, just what we were able to use to get some level of stability to get us through the review process. And we'll do live streams for more in-depth overclocking with this, where we'll have more time to play around with it. With about 2 hours of additional testing not shown on this chart, we're still unable to get a 5.1 gigahertz hold on all core in all applications. We got it to hold sometimes, sort of, in games, but not always, and that meant it wasn't suitable for the review. We settled on a 5.0 gigahertz all-core with an AVX offset of 1, unfortunately, and a cache ratio of 44. We're fairly certain that we can make 5.1 to 5.2 gigahertz work in some applications, but it would require a lot more trial and error and would require an AVX offset still. The cache ratio is our weakest point on this particular piece of silicon. We tried up to 48x, but even at 46 and 45, it just wasn't stable. We need to spend more time tuning VCCIO and VCCSA to get it to stick, but we ran out of time leading into the review process, and we called it here. This still gives you a great idea of where it'll fall for someone who's not a heavily experienced overclocker, and then as always, you can check out our streams for additional work on these CPUs as we get more time with them. Blender's the first of our production benchmarks. This is where AMD has managed to carve out an extremely strong position over the last 2 years especially, although it did struggle back when the 8700K and R7-2700 were the top contenders. In the Cycles tile-based renderer, the 11600K required 22.9 minutes to complete the render, roughly tied with the 5600X. The AMD CPU no longer holds a meaningful advantage here and happens to be more expensive right now, but it does have a significant efficiency edge. The AMD CPU needed about 66 watts during this workload, while Intel was around 125, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Clearly, if you're serious about using a CPU for regular tile-based rendering, in addition to any CUDA rendering you might do, an R7 or R9 would make the most sense. But the 5600X and the 11600K do about the same here for a cheaper option, at least when ignoring power. Chromium code compile is next. Like we've said in the past, we can't represent all of programming with a single benchmark, but this gives you an initial idea. The R5-5600X required 131 minutes to complete this code compile, while the 11600K needed about 124 minutes. This is actually a big swing for the 11600K, and we're not surprised that it happened in code compile specifically. The difference is nearly a 6% reduction in time required, and overclocking the 11600K improves it to 114 minutes, or a reduction of about 7.8%. For top performers, the AMD R9-5900X remains among the best value for someone working in this type of environment professionally, while the 5600X and 11600K alike offer decent performance for someone on a tighter budget or with a gaming-first focus. In 7-zip compression testing, measured in millions of instructions per second, the Intel i5-11600K stock CPU completed 61,000 MIPS and ranked between the R5-3600 and R5-5600X. The 5600X benefits from a 13% advantage here, which is not just measurable, but if you do a lot of this, actually noticeable in time required to complete frequent compression tasks. Intel is doing better keeping up and has taken some production tasks away from AMD or encroached on them this cycle, but it is not the leader in all scenarios. The R7-5800X and R9-5900X prove, even between each other, that cores have a heavy influence in this particular test. But obviously there are other benefits to AMD's architecture too, like perhaps cache. There are quicker options for people who have professional budgets and have to do this work, as always, and you should be looking towards the R9 CPUs if you're one of those people. For someone in the middle who's doing this sometimes or can't afford one of the higher end CPUs, the 5600X remains a top choice. Overclocked, the 11600K gained 7%, not bad, but still behind. In decompression, the 11600K completed 72,000 MIPS as compared to the 5600X's 88,000 MIPS. That allowed the 5600X a massive lead of 22% here. The 5600X, even though the 11600K is encroaching on its gaming performance, is starting to stack significant leads where the best Intel can do in production tasks is grab single-digit percentage leads. One standout being, again, code compile. In Adobe Premiere Pro, we're using the Puget bench now and creating an aggregate score to show rendering and encoding time, live playback speed, filters, warps, and other effects, all combined into one higher is better score. The 11600K scored 723 points stock, just ahead of the 3700X. The 5600X held a 2.1% lead, so not nearly as meaningful as in decompression or compression. They're a lot closer here, and if you're just doing gaming and maybe occasional video editing, the 11600K is shaping up to be an actual value option. Photoshop, once a stronghold for Intel, returns as a technical strength for Intel with a 1078 score as compared to the 5600X's 984 points. That's a 9.6% lead, one of Intel's better positions in these charts, with the overclock pushing the 11600K up to 1156 points, or a 7% gain. Power consumption is last, starting with Blender and measured at the 5-minute mark to ensure a post-tau expiry number. The 11600K pulled about 125 watts before VRM efficiency losses here. That's about dead on with the marketed TDP number, although technically TDP isn't a power representation. For comparison, the i5-11600X pulled about 67 watts in the same test. It's actually completely absurd how much more power efficient the i5-11600X is. We're getting roughly the same performance, plus or minus a few percentage points in favor of either one, and yet it's pulling 58 watts less power. The overclocked 11600K pulled 230 watts, although our cooler was still well within its capabilities and had some additional thermal headroom for more of an OC. For power consumption prior to tau expiry, the Cinebench multi-threaded numbers have the 11600K stock CPU at about 143 watts. This number is the one you'd pay attention to if allowing some motherboards to run how they're auto-configured, whereas the previous number would be more relatable if you're under a sustained load and using a motherboard that follows Intel's guidance, or if you manually configure it to follow the guidance. The 11600K looks a lot worse with these numbers, but if set up following guidance, that's only for 56 seconds and is much more tenable than allowing it to just run like this ad infinitum. For single-threaded power consumption, the 11600K stock CPU is about 41 watts, with the 10600K previously around 31 watts. Intel's power consumption for an individual core has increased generationally here. So that's it for our 11600K benchmarks. Couple things here that are important. The 5600X is completely ridiculous. It's ludicrous insofar as its power efficiency. So looking at the power charts, this doesn't matter to a lot of people, but just as a technology point to make, looking at the power charts, you have a part that does 60-something watts, 65, 68 watts, the 5600X, versus, say, an 11600K, which following Intel official guidance is doing about 125 watts for sustained load, ignoring tau because 56 seconds, whatever. If you're doing a sustained load, it doesn't matter. It's just invisible at that point. So 120-something watts versus 60-something, and yet the 5600X is in some cases murdering the 11600K in production, or in best cases, roughly tied with at least one easily memorable instance of Intel pulling ahead. That would be compile benchmarks. The efficiency is just favoring the 5600X still. Now, that doesn't necessarily matter for a gaming targeted product. And a lot of people who are building more cost-effective gaming rigs really don't care that much about an extra 60 watts here or there. So in gaming, Intel now, with the 11600K, is in a significantly better position than it was maybe a month ago, where there was really almost nothing. Well, the 10700K came down in price due to severe price cuts because of competition. But at the original MSRPs, Intel was in a rough spot, and it was really only the lower end SKUs that started to compete hard with AMD. So now the 11600K is extremely competitive with the 5600X. The 5600X, if you are planning to do either specific or a lot of production workloads, but you don't have the budget to step up to an R7, R9, whatever, then the 5600X still makes more sense, because in some applications like compression, decompression, you're anywhere from 13 to 22% better on a 5600X, which is obscene. Or in something like Blender, you're roughly equal to an 11600K, but more power efficient. Now, if you're only gaming, or you're primarily gaming, you're trying to build a gaming-focused rig, the 11600K remains highly tunable. It's not the easiest to overclock. It's a bit harder to overclock for us on our chip anyway than our 10600K was. But out of the box, it's extremely competitive gaming. It's cheaper, ticks all the right boxes to be a value-focused CPU. So we can actually recommend the 11600K for a gaming-focused or gaming-first build, and it still has some production capabilities. But as soon as you're tipping into, I'm going to do more production workloads territory, you should buy a 5600X instead, maybe with the exception of Code Compile, but we can't test every scenario for Code Compile either. So for this one, where the 11700K, like the 3800 XT, should be snapped out of existence, the 11600K actually comes out looking very competitive in gaming, specifically factoring in the price. That's its major advantage now. The same position that AMD was in approximately 3 to 4 years ago. So hopefully that roughly sums it up for you. The 11600K has places where we would definitely recommend it as an option for a budget gaming build. The 5600X remains an extremely strong competitor as well. And if the price falls a bit back towards the $300 mark, it'll be a harder choice. But it is the one we would go with for most production tasks, barring a couple, like Compile. Otherwise, they're both good for gaming. The 11600K is just more cost-effective at this point. And the 5600X walks away with a badge of honor for its power efficiency. So some actually really good competition here, depending on what benchmarks you look at. Again, Alder Lake is probably the thing that makes this the weirdest, because that's supposed to come out later this year. So something to consider if you're looking at building a PC. But you can always wait in this industry, and at some point you got to build something. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. And we'll see you all next time.